Tonight, these people behind me are already feeling the pinch. They're having to make decisions about what they cross off the list when it comes to spending. They're in the front line of the war against inflation and they know they're going to pay the price. Well, now they're putting their questions to Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Welcome to Q&A. What a lovely welcome. Thank you so much. I'm Stan Grant, and now for a week when the Treasurer Jim Chalmers has been telling us we need to have a conversation. We've all heard that. Is the time for talk over? Tonight, is he prepared to take any hard decisions? Please welcome the Treasurer. As always, you can live stream us around the country on iView, and of course there's all the socials as well if you want to get involved in that conversation. Quanda is the hashtag. Please get involved, and we'll start tonight with a story that's gripping the nation right now. Here's Sally Hodges.
At the vigil for schoolboy Cassius Turvey at Town Hall last night, Green Senator David Shoebridge said that he wished there were more people from federal parliament at the vigils listening and hearing powerful truths. Do you agree that there should have been greater attendance from politicians, and did you attend one of the vigils?
Jim?
Yep, thanks very much. And first of all, I think it is important that we acknowledge this sorry business at the beginning of the show. I think the thieving of Cassius's life is one of those moments, I think, where it makes all of us pause and wonder whether we are doing enough. Whether we are. I wasn't at the vigil this morning. I was in Perth, and at the event that I was at, we had a discussion about the vigil that had taken place in Perth. I'm told that one of the, frankly, stunning moments about it was when Cassius's family were, behaving with incredible grace, given what they'd been through. And so I think we should acknowledge that too. We should acknowledge that we've got a long way to go as a country still, despite all the progress that we've made. And if your question is whether or not Cassius's death makes me and my colleagues understand that more needs to be done, then the answer is yes.
Jim, there is a vote looming on a voice to Parliament, but I was struck by something that Noel Pearson, one of the advocates for the voice, said in his Boyer lectures, and he said that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people are the most unloved people in Australia. I would have to say sadly that as an Aboriginal person I share that view. Why are we so unloved?
Well, I mean, it's unacceptable if that's the case. I've spent a bit of time with Noel over the years. He's someone I listen to, and those Boyer lectures were, characteristically thoughtful and impactful and powerful. And again, we need to listen to the First Nations people of this country, not just listen, but act. The voice is a crucial part of that, in my opinion, but not just that. There is so much more that we need to do, and we have a government which is committed to doing more.
Sally, thank you so much for your question. I was at an event earlier today and there was a minute's silence there as well, and it is being felt right around the country, and our thoughts are certainly with Cassius's family. Thank you again for the question. Let's move on now to our questions on the cost of living. Let's hear from Fiona Moore from Newcastle. Fiona.
Thanks. So you called the budget a bread and butter budget, but with non-discretionary items rising faster than CPI indexation, welfare recipients like myself are meant to be grateful for that rise. What essentials should I be cutting from my budget?
Yeah, well, thank you, Fiona, for your question. And this goes to what is the biggest challenge in our economy and in our communities, in our society right now, which is that the cost of living are going through the roof. And that has a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable amongst us, and we understand that. the budget in so many different ways that I handed down in Canberra 9 nights ago was about this challenge. And it had within it, as you I think are alluding to in your question, Fiona, billions of dollars of extra payments which come from the automatic indexation. I'm not for a moment claiming credit for that, but that is an important feature and function of our budget, that when inflation is growing as it is right now, then payments twice a year try to at least keep up with that. And I know that's not always enough. I know that's often not enough. But that's an important feature of the budget. My responsibility to you, Fiona, and to really the whole country is to try and take the right economic decisions at a national level in the context of all of this inflation to make sure that we're not making inflation worse, and if anything, we're investing in the sorts of things that make it easier for people. And in the context of a budget which has $1 trillion of debt and it's in deficit as far as the eye can see, then we've got to try and work out how do we provide that cost of living relief in a responsible way. And by responsible, I mean how do we provide money to people without making the inflation problem worse, which is really my major concern. And so we've got some cost of living relief in there for the cost of medicines, the cost of childcare, paid parental leave, housing affordability, and we've got a policy to get wages growing again. And I understand and I can feel...
And the question was, Treasurer, and I might just go back to you, Fiona, on this.
Yeah.
You're having to make real decisions. The Treasurer is talking about projections. He's talking about measures that are going to come in over the coming years. But in your situation right now, what are you having to decide?
Well, it's things like healthcare. I mean, I had an eye test the other day and I have to go for a further scan. So the cost of that I then have to take from, say, the next doctor's appointment they had booked. I'll have to push that back again because my GP doesn't bulk bill anymore and things like that. And DSP will go up with inflation, yes, but still playing catch up and it's still falling behind. And
the reality is, Treasurer, that you said in the budget, it is people like Fiona, people who are indebted or people who are struggling, who are going to have to bear the burden of this war against inflation. When does this turn around for someone like Fiona?
Well, again, the best thing that we can do is to try and address the root cause of this problem, which is the inflation, and that's what the budget was about. In addition to that, and even in the context of a budget which was quite restrained in its spending, still big investments in Medicare, still the indexation of those payments, doing what we can, what we responsibly can to make life a little bit easier for people. But I don't want to pretend to Fiona or to anyone in Fiona's position that the budget 9 nights ago fixed all of these challenges. And I do need to be upfront with all of you about the nature of this challenge that we are confronting right now. And we will do what we can, but we need to do what we can in the context of only promising what we can afford and trying to work out what our best contribution to this problem is. And our best contribution to this is being restrained in our spending, giving some cost of living relief where it's responsible, and investing in the sorts of things that will get us out of this.
But if inflation is public enemy number one, this is, as you've said, it's the dragon you have to slay. It is people like Fiona. It is people on the front line of this who are going to feel the heat.
Yeah,
because anything that helps them fuels inflation. This is the bind you're in.
Yeah.
Can you truly tell us where inflation will peak out? You projected at 7.75% in the budget. That's gone. The Reserve Bank is now talking about 8%. Internationally, it'll top 9%. You can't really sit here and tell people where this will top out, can you?
Well, nobody has a perfect crystal ball, but the expectations of the Reserve Bank and the Treasury is that this inflation challenge will get a bit worse until the end of the year and then
means
start
interest
to
rates
moderate.
keep going up, doesn't it?
Well, the Reserve Bank themselves have said that they expect interest rates to go up a bit further. They take those decisions independently. I don't preempt or second-guess those. But I take responsibility for my part in this as the country's Treasurer. I think for too long we've had people in roles like mine who pretend that they have nothing to do with it, right? I accept responsibility in the budgets that I put together. And the main thing I can do here, the worst thing that could happen for Fiona and for people around Australia, is if we let this inflation get out of control. And you summed it up really well, Stan, a moment ago. If you are not careful with your spending, if you are somehow ill-disciplined, then we would have this inflation problem worse for longer. And that's what I'm trying to avoid.
Of course, Fiona, when it comes to your own personal spending, where do you sit each week after you've paid the essentials?
Pension day tomorrow, so actually do have $20 in because it came in for some reason late today.
$20?
$20 in my bank account at the moment for pension day tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, we're working week to week very much and shuffling and.
Good luck. It's a common story. Thank you for bringing
Thanks, Fiona.
that story and that question. There are plenty of people finding it incredibly difficult right now, like Fiona. Here's truck driver Jeff Threlfo. And we have another video as well coming in from George Paul from Leabrook in South Australia. Take a look.
Thanks, Jim, for your time. I have 7 children, ranging from 14 to 28. So you can imagine any help is appreciated. When are we going to see more help with cost of living? We need to see a plan, not just talk. Why don't the big energy companies get pressured to give us more relief? Thank you.
Hello. We live in South Australia, my wife and my disabled son. Our last account, electricity account, came to almost $1,600, which is absolutely very expensive. Now, living in Australia, a country with plenty of energy resources, there's no excuse for such a big account for a family of 3 living in a unit. And I read that the prices are going to go even higher next year, maybe about 50%. You know, this is a lot. This is a lot. So could you please let us know how you can help us pay our energy bills?
$1,600 for an electricity bill for a family living in a unit. And it's going to get worse, isn't it?
That's our expectation. And prices, as everybody here knows, certainly Jeff and George know, electricity prices started going up earlier in the year. A big reason for that, which doesn't make it any easier, but the main driver of that is the war in Ukraine, which is causing havoc with global energy markets and pushing up the price of electricity here.
I'm going to stop you there because this is the conversation that you've been having, and you've been having it for 10 days since the budget.
Yeah.
They specifically asked you, what are you going to do?
And I'm keen to get to that. What I want to acknowledge first is that even though these pressures are coming at us from around the world, they are felt around the kitchen table. I do acknowledge that. The work that we are doing now in our government is to work out what kind of intervention we can make in the energy market so that the sorts of price rises that are expected, that are forecast at the moment, don't eventuate.
Okay, so can we go through some of those?
Of course.
Are you going to give a subsidy to people directly to allow them to meet their energy bills?
Well, there are 3 paths that we can choose from. And it's difficult for me as Treasurer to kind of think out loud about these. There's some market sensitivity and there's some work that we're still doing, to be upfront with you, but there are broadly 3 paths. The first path is something in the tax area. The second path is the one that you just referred to, Stan, which is around subsidies, whether that to be to people or to companies. And thirdly, whether there's some kind of change in regulation that can bring the price down.
And in terms of precisely for the reasons you said to Fiona about inflationary pressure, you're not going to give people a cash handout, are you?
That would be unlikely, but we don't want to rule it out, because if this situation continues to deteriorate over time, you want to have all of the options. But our preference is to do something with regulation. And the work that we're doing right now, the work that I was doing even up to coming on the show, is to see with other ministers like Chris Bowen and Ed Husic and Madeleine King and the Prime Minister, whether there's some kind of intervention that we can make to keep these prices down. That's our preference. But we don't want to rule out subsidies or tax. It may be necessary down the track, but let's see if we can do something with regulation first.
When you're talking about regulation, are you talking here about setting a price, about trying to put a lid on the price? And for that, you're going to have to be able to regulate that, hold some of the supply back from going overseas and cap it, aren't you?
that is one of the options, is around price caps. And a lot of people have made those suggestions to us publicly, that would be one of the options. And that's obviously one thing that we're considering. It's not the only type of regulation, but it's one of the ones that's most commonly suggested to us. We have a little more work to do on this, and so I can't tell you tonight, can't tell George and Jeff the final conclusion, but to reassure them that we know that electricity prices that began before the electricity price rises, which began before the election, are continuing now and intensifying.
In fact, what you said is over the next 2 years it'll be 56% higher. So that's another $800 that George is going to have to find. So his bill of $1,600 now is going to be $2,400.
Yeah, it's going to be 20% and then 30%.
Yeah.
The 20% is already flowing. Some of you are already paying that. That was the price rise that was hidden by our predecessors during the election campaign. That was the front end of it, 20%. We're expecting, or Treasury's expecting, another 30% next year. Obviously, any responsible government confronted with that kind of number and what it means for Jeff and George and for many of you has to consider its options, and that's what we're doing.
If you can't give us an answer now about what intervention will look like, can you give us a timeline? It's been 10 days since the budget. Prices are going up. We know that people are paying more right across the board for inflation. Are we going to see this in the next week, 2 weeks, the next month? How long is it going to take you?
Well, first of all, I know that 10 days can sometimes sound like a long time, but
it does when you're trying to stretch $20.
Yeah, but what we're dealing with here is we've got to balance the fact that a lot of these companies have got international contracts. There's a lot of market sensitivity. I mean, we do care about our reputation as a trading nation. We've got a lot of contracts with Korea and Japan and elsewhere. And so there are a whole bunch of issues associated with this, and it's more complex than it sounds. But that's not a reason not to act here. It's a reason to act in a considered, responsible and sensible way. I think anybody watching the show tonight should expect that the government will move as quickly as they can, Can I talk about before? But there are lots of issues at play.
Before Christmas, are we going to see a plan, a costed plan with detail before Christmas?
That's my intention, yeah, certainly. But as I said, I'm doing my best not to I'm doing my best to be upfront with you about this. We are working on it more or less around the clock right now, and we will move on it as soon as we responsibly can. But there are a lot of complexities here that we need to weigh up. You don't want to make a change here which causes all kinds of unintended consequences elsewhere. We want to get it right, and we'll get it right as soon as we can.
Let's take a question from Liam Thorne.
Increased prices of fossil fuels have generated massive windfall profits for companies in the energy sector who are exploiting Australian resources and sending them overseas. Is the Albanese Labor government open to a windfall profits tax to fund key programs and deliver electricity cost relief to Australian households?
Yeah, thanks, Liam. So, as people are probably aware, there's a tax regime that applies to the gas companies called the PRRT.
Petrol Resource Rent Tax.
Yeah. And when prices are high, we get a bit more of a return from the PRRT. But I do understand, and I suspect from your question, Liam, that in the community there is an appetite for us to get a better return on our resources. I do understand that. I get it put to me. I've been in 5 cities in 3 days. I get put to me in every city, right? I understand that. We get a little bit more. We got about $200 million more this year from the PRRT because prices were high, and the company tax take went up a fair bit as well, and that's related. My preference when it comes to energy markets, at least in the near term, is to try and do something on regulation. There is work going on in my department, which began under my predecessor, to his credit, to see whether there's a more effective way to tax gas, to make sure that the PRRT is working as it should. What I like to do, I like to approach these things in a pretty considered way. When that advice comes to me at some point, I'll consider it then. I'll try and involve the Australian public in that conversation. But our first port of call, our priority, the thing that we're working on, is on some of these regulatory options.
When you say get it working as it should, how much is it actually contributing to the budget right now?
I think from memory, it's a couple of billion this year.
As a percentage, it's not even 1%, is it?
No, it wouldn't be 1%.
Not even 0.5%.
It wouldn't be, no. Some of these companies also pay other kinds of tax, but I think the broader point, where Liam's coming from and where I think you're coming from, Stan, is we want to make sure that we're getting a fair return for our resources. And that's what this work that is happening is all about. But I guess I wanted to indicate to you that of all of the options available to us, all of the levers available to us, the one that we are putting all of our attention into at the moment is on the regulatory side rather than the tax side.
Hands up if you think that companies should be paying a bit more tax for what they're making overseas. Yeah. Well, that's almost everyone. So you're on a winner if you want to do something. You're not going to lose a vote. And if you look at the numbers, I mean, there's some ATO transparency figures released. The data shows almost 800 companies paid no tax in 2020-21. Ampol reported over $20 billion in revenue, reported no taxable income for 2020-21. Woodside made a profit of $1.64 billion in the first half of 2022. Santos, $1.27 billion first half underlying profit. I mean, these are enormous figures. And is it fair to say as well, when it comes to oil and gas, they're not paying as much as they could, so there's room for you to move there?
Well, there are a couple of things going on in those numbers that you read out. First of all, the reason we know these numbers is because we have tried to make the tax system more transparent. I think it's a good thing. When these sorts of numbers come out, you all and governments can work out whether they think that's appropriate. In a lot of those examples that you read out, and this won't always be a popular view to point it out, but we need it for the sake of completeness. What happens in some of these industries, particularly in resources, is when they make a big investment up front, they can write that investment off over time, and that almost always explains why some of these companies, at least for the time being, are not paying much tax, if at all, because they're writing off those investments. And that's legal, and in lots of ways that's appropriate. What we would like to do, and what we are doing, what was in the budget 9 nights ago, is to do something more meaningful when it comes to multinationals. So we raise about another $1 billion out of multinationals, a combination of changing the way they manage their debt, changing the way they manage tax havens, and making the system more transparent. I know a lot of people would like us to do more than that, but I think that's an important step in the right direction.
Are you still scarred, though? Labor has a history of this. We remember back to the minerals resource rent tax, the super profits tax, the backlash that you get, and you were advising at the time, I think, in the...
It rings a bell, Stan.
It does ring a bell. Does it also scar you for this? Is it something you're a bit shy of?
I wouldn't describe it exactly like that, but I think anyone who goes through experiences in their work life, you learn from them. You try not to overlearn from them, you try not to underlearn from them. That was a pretty brutal experience. A bit over a decade ago. But my job is to take the experience that I'm very grateful for from that period during the global financial crisis, take that experience, learn from it, but to make the right decisions in 2022 for the circumstances we confront now.
There's some more questions about tax. I'm going to get to those a bit later, but let's hear now from Marzi DeSanti.
Hello, Mr Chalmers, Treasurer.
Hi.
Although you've had experience with budgets in the past, I believe working with Wayne Swan, former Treasurer, what experience have you had in the real business world, not just the political world, to trust you to steer the economy through these turbulent and unpredictable times?
I think you worked at McDonald's, didn't you, once? Very briefly.
I did, very briefly. Marzi, thanks for your question, genuinely, because I think inevitably when you're in politics, when you're in a cabinet, when you're in a government, you bring all kinds of different experiences. And our cabinet is more diverse, I think, than people might expect. You are 100% right that my experience is in economic policy. And it has been in working in government. And I tell you, there hasn't been a day that I've been the Treasurer where I haven't benefited from that experience that I had during the global financial crisis in particular. And I'm proud of the work that I did with Wayne. I'm proud of the work that we did collectively as a government. Now, ideally, in a cabinet, you'll have all kinds of experiences, and we do. And the experience that I bring is from that pretty difficult period. Now, we're in another difficult period now in the global economy. I think if you read Stan's most recent book, he talks about hinge points in history, right, in Stan's book. And the economy is in a similar kind of a place. We've got all this global uncertainty. It's different to how it was in 2008-9. It's a bit different during the start of the pandemic, but it's a very serious time. And I am grateful for and draw on my experience, which is overwhelmingly about national economic policy.
I'm glad to see you're reading my book, Treasurer, but one of the things it also points out is that the world is at a hinge point because we have deeply embedded structural problems and we have deep inequality. And the reality is that people like you and I, sitting here with the privilege of well-paid jobs, the privilege of education, are not doing it as tough as other people here. What qualifies you to even begin to understand that Fiona sitting here with $20 in a bank, wondering, you know, when the pension check is going to come, to understand what that lived experience is like?
Well, I grew up in a place called Logan City, and our government is full of people who grew up in difficult circumstances. We've got a Prime Minister from Public Housing, we've got a Treasurer from Logan City, and right through our Cabinet. And I do understand, I think it's important that you did acknowledge that our situation now, yours and mine, is very different, and I'm not pretending otherwise. But one of the things that I bring to this job, in addition to the experience that Marzi asked me about, is growing up in a place like Logan City. And again, you know, there's not a day in my professional life where I'm not grateful for having grown up in Logan, one of the great communities of this country, but with its share of challenges, and where I don't reflect in one way or another on the challenges that we confront in communities like Logan. It's why, for example, the big new part in the budget that I handed down was about housing affordability, because I recognise that a big part of the story that we're talking about here is making it more affordable to be able to live near where the jobs and opportunities are. It's a huge priority for me. It's a huge challenge that we've got in Logan and in communities like it around Australia. So, you know, I will let the Australian people judge whether or not they think my mix of life experience and professional experience is right or not. My job is to learn from everything that I've seen and done in my life and to try and make great decisions on your behalf. And that's really all I'm focused on.
I'll move on to some questions in a minute, but I just want to reflect on this. I mean, obviously, your life has changed a lot since you become Treasurer, and you're facing a perfect storm from rising inflation, war in Ukraine, a potential recession, potentially internationally as well. When you go to sleep at night and you think about these things, personally, how does this weigh on you? Do you think about the person who could lose their house? The person who's wondering whether they could take their kid to the dentist, the person who's wondering about putting, food on the table or fuel in the car. How real is this to you?
Oh, of course I think about that. I mean, I think about that all of the time. And what worries me is if you don't get the economic decisions right, then some of that vulnerability, some of that disadvantage, that can cascade through the generations. I mean, the whole reason I'm here is because I think a first-rate country like ours should be able to avoid disadvantage cascading through the generations. That's my motor. And everyone's got different motivations for the work that they do. That's mine. And sometimes that means taking difficult decisions in budgets or in economic policy, which take a little while to bear fruit. But once you understand and realise that the purpose of your work is to take the right decisions, even if they're politically difficult, then as long as you carry around the experiences that you pick up around your own community and around the country, and you make the right decisions for the right reasons, then, you know, that's a pretty good start.
Well, if you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A. We're live with Treasurer Jim Chalmers. A little later, we're going to get to who should be the new face on our $5 note. There may be some suggestions there. We're going to do a quick-fire round of questions now where we're looking, Treasurer, for some, not from talking points and not from briefing documents, but quick yes, no or short answers. We'll take a question from Bilal Muzaffar.
So the rise of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister in the UK is a moment to celebrate the evolving diversity in UK politics. Will we see a Prime Minister of colour here in our lifetime?
Yes. We've just elected the most diverse intake of new MPs on the Labor side nationally in the history of this country. And, you know, I have been spending time with the Sally Situs and the Zanita Mascarenas and Fatima Payman and all of these absolutely unbelievable new representatives from very diverse communities. I have absolutely no doubt that we will see a Prime Minister of colour in my lifetime.
Do they have to line up behind you? Is it something you'd like to see for yourself?
They can line up in front of me.
Political answer. Here's Jeremy Gray.
Currently, 3.3 million Australians live below the poverty line. Will the government commit to ending poverty, or does it believe that poverty is acceptable?
No, I don't think anyone can believe that poverty is acceptable. And if it was an easy challenge to address, we would have fixed it by now. You've got to chip away at a problem of that magnitude. I think housing's a big part of the story. I talked about that already. And there are other ways that we can support families and people doing it tough. And as a Labor government, we are always looking for opportunities to do more. We don't want to ever give people false hope that you can just click your fingers and make poverty disappear. But you can commit to work away at alleviating it and eliminating it, and that's what we do.
Isn't there a structural issue here, though? Because we are seeing now that intergenerational poverty is becoming embedded, that privilege is embedded, that the rich are getting richer. They're going to get richer even during an inflationary cycle because they're earning more on what they've got saved away, and they're passing that on to their children. At what point do we have to get serious about taxing inheritance, about looking at intergenerational wealth?
Well, I mean, I want to make it clear, we're not contemplating an inheritance tax or anything that looks like that.
Why not, though? I mean, they've got a round of applause,
Yeah.
and we know that it is embedded. We talked about our own situations, and our children are going to be better because they're going to inherit from us. Other people are not going to have that. Why not?
I think
Other countries do.
I think that there are other ways to make the tax system fairer and to generate this kind of intergenerational mobility that we want to see. And, you know, we made a start on that on budget night, you know, taxing multinationals differently, tax compliance measures, some other measures in the budget. And we need to continue to work away at that front, on that front. I think we can make this tax system fairer. I just don't want to give you the sense that we're going to act on that particular one because we're not.
A video now from Peter Pepin.
Labor promised a reduction in power prices of $275 by 2025. How is this calculated, given the uncertain current economic times?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Well, the truth is it was calculated from modelling in 2021. And you're right to allude in your question to the fact that a lot has happened since then. And if you think about the war in Ukraine, which a lot of people anticipated would be a 2 or 3 week affair, has become something that's lasted many months, and the pressure on global energy markets has intensified really substantially. And so that $275 figure was from modelling done in 2021, and it was about an outcome in 2025. And in 2022, we've got a war in Europe, which is pushing up prices for everyone.
Sounds like you're saying now you can't deliver on that. 275, you can't deliver on that.
Well, what I'm saying is we need to recognise the reality. We don't know in 2022 what the impact of the war in Ukraine is going to be on a 2025 outcome. That's just to level with people. It remains the fact, and the modelling that we're talking about in 2021, it remains the fact that the cheapest new sources of energy are renewable energy. That's still the case. But I don't think we can ignore the fact that when the modelling was done in 2021 and an outcome in 2025, we've got this enormous event which has changed substantially the outlook for energy prices, not just in Australia but around the world.
The war in Ukraine was underway during the election and you were still promising it. But that 275, you're saying now you can't deliver on that. You can't be certain that you will deliver on that number.
Well, we don't know what the situation will be in 2025, but the point that you made at the start of your question, I think I need to pull up, which is even though the war was happening when the election was on, most people, including experts that spend their whole professional lives monitoring these things, thought the war would be over quickly, and they underestimated the impact on energy pipelines and all of that. And so I think it is self-evident that a longer war in Europe with a more intense impact on global energy markets is going to impact us here.
Yeah, and there go a whole lot of projections, but we'll come to that. Let's hear from Anam Khan.
The budget paints a pretty bleak outlook. Should we be prepared for a recession?
Yeah, thanks, Anam. I don't think so. Certainly not the Treasury's expectation in their forecasts that we will go that way. But Europe will, UK will, other countries are at risk as well, and we won't be completely immune from that. When the global economy turns down substantially, as it did almost 15 years ago, as it did a couple of years ago, we can't completely escape the consequences of that. But our expectation is that we will avoid a recession. Our economy will slow substantially next year, quite substantially, as a consequence of the global downturn, the impact of higher interest rates and some other issues as well. And so my view about the economy is I am really quite optimistic about the future of our economy and the future of our country. But over the next 6 or 12 or 18 months, we are in for some very tricky terrain from a global point of view, and we will feel the impact here.
But if Europe is, the United States is skating very close to that, dropping down to about 1% growth. You're forecasting 1.5% in the second half of next year. That's getting perilously close. If we keep seeing interest rates go up, unemployment starts to edge up, people stop spending, we know that's going to have an impact. So what you're saying right now, the answer to that question is you don't know, do you, whether we'll go into recession or not? You're hoping, but you don't know.
Well, what I'm saying is that I don't expect us to go into recession. And if your point is that things can change, of course they can. And the biggest risk is actually if we let inflation get out of control and interest rates have to chase higher and higher inflation, then that makes, as the Reserve Bank Governor said a couple of nights ago, that makes a recession more likely here, but it's not our expectation.
Our last quickfire question, and it comes from Conrad Mikalski.
Just a quick either or. What would you rather? Everyone earning more than $180K a year receive an $8,000 bonus each year, or free university education and dental in Medicare?
It's a multiple choice.
Well, I think on education, I think our HECS system works pretty well. And I know that's not your view, I can tell by your reaction.
Well, he's paying back a debt while inflation's going up.
Yeah, understood. I think the HECS system works relatively well. If your question is, can we make the tax system fairer, I think we can. I know that you're referring to a very specific tax change there, and you're probably aware that we haven't changed our view on that in the 9 days since I handed down the budget. But I do think we should be looking for ways to make the tax system fairer, and we should be doing that so that we can fund the things that our society values, like education and public health.
If you've been talking a lot about, having foresight and the things you can't expect, knowing what you know now, looking at the downturn internationally, the impact of inflation, looking at fairness and intergenerational inequality, would you have committed to stage 3 tax cuts all the way to 200,000 with the cost it's going to take from the budget if you knew what you knew now?
Well, even better than that, Stan. I mean, when those tax cuts were presented to the Parliament, what we tried to do at the time was amend them. And we tried to amend them so that people on middle incomes...
But now you want to deliver them.
Well, your question was, if we had our time again, would we do it differently?
Now, knowing what you know now, can you commit to it knowing what we know now?
Well, they are in the budget already. They come in more than 2 budgets away. We've got more pressing priorities that we're working on. But your question was, with the benefit of hindsight, I mean, when they were presented to the Parliament, we said we should find a way to let tax relief flow to people on middle incomes and not on some of those higher incomes. We tried to amend it, we were unsuccessful. And so we had to make a choice. Do we vote for the whole thing or do we try and knock it all over? I still believe that people on middle incomes, in the context of bracket creep and all of the other kind of jargon that people are familiar with when we talk about tax. There is a case for tax relief for people.
Yeah, but someone earning $200,000 a year and getting, you know, $9,000, almost $10,000 extra, is there a case for that?
Well, we made it clear at the time that we would have designed them differently at the beginning. They are now a feature of the budget. I have been upfront with people and said that the cost of these tax cuts is rising and that there is a broader conversation to have, not just in this area, about how we make the budget more sustainable.
You sound like someone who's not really fully committed to these. You sound as if you really don't want to do it. You don't want to do it, do you?
I wouldn't describe it that way. I think in the discussion of the last few weeks, and I'm not going to pretend I wasn't part of this discussion, you know, I think inevitably when you've got $250 billion of tax cuts to come in, you've got all these structural pressures on the budget and you're working out your priorities, the country will want to hold those tax cuts up to the light. And I've been part of that conversation. But we haven't changed our view on them coming in. We had a crack at the time at making them different. We were unsuccessful. And they, as a consequence, are a feature of the budget. And there are other ways that we can make the tax system and the budget fairer and more sustainable.
We'll come to that. I think you might mean watch this space, but we will. Here's the question now from Samer Hannah.
Yeah. In the core of the Labour Party identity, you usually care for the low income and the poor and the middle class. How in the new government that you form now will give tax cuts and childcare subsidies for people earning more than $300,000?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things about that. On the early childhood education subsidies, on the cheaper childcare policy, the reason that we don't cut it off at a lowish income or a middle income is because we see early childhood education as part of the education system, not part of the social security system. And so, you know, state schools don't means test kids in prep or grade 1. And so we think that there's an important economic benefit to be had for the country and important educational benefits for little kids if they have access to early childhood education. And that's why we have never seen it, or we haven't seen it in this policy, as social security. We've seen it as a different kind of investment, and that's how we treat it differently. Now, in terms of the broader picture about what do we do for people on lower incomes, one of the things that I'm proudest of, we've only been in government for 5 months. The very first thing that I took to our cabinet with Tony Burke, my colleague, was our support for a decent minimum wage rise. And that, I think, was an early demonstration of a core Labor value, which is that people on low incomes deserve a decent minimum wage so that they can try and keep up with the rising costs of living. And I think those sorts of decisions that we took then and other decisions that we've taken keep faith with the core Labor values that you're talking about.
So do you consider like 300,000 is a middle income?
Look, I don't put definitions on people, how much people earn. It depends where you live. It depends what your costs are.
$300,000?
Well, the reason I don't want to do this, Stan, I understand why you ask it. The reason I don't like doing it is because I don't want to put a kind of an arbitrary, if you're on this side of it, you're this. If you're on that side of it, you're that. I don't really want to put labels on people. Obviously, if you're making $300,000, you're doing really well. You're obviously doing really well. And if your question is about our early childhood policy and whether or not we're helping people on reasonable incomes, good incomes, like the one that you're nominating, yes, we are. And that's because we don't see it as social security.
More than that, because someone, as of next year, earning $500,000, a family earning $500,000, $500,000 a year, will qualify for a childcare subsidy from the government. Why should any family on $500,000 take 1 cent of subsidy from the government?
Well, the comparison that I would draw again is we don't say to a family making that much money that they can't send their kid to a public school, for example. We see this as education. We see it as getting people into the workforce. We see it as making it easier for newish parents, particularly new mums, to work more and earn more if they want to give them that choice. And I understand that people have got different views about that. I genuinely do. And when we made the policy, we weighed up all of this. But if you don't consider it social security, and we don't, it's not welfare, if you consider an investment in education and workforce participation and all of the economic benefits, then I think it's a really important investment.
Just you mentioned wages. You mentioned the minimum wage. There was also a commitment, wasn't there, to getting wages on par with inflation, and you're not going to deliver that. You're talking about 2024, but that's hoping that you get inflation under control. So people are going backwards, aren't they?
Well, two parts about that. I mean, first of all, when it came to minimum wage workers, we supported an increase that kept up with inflation. That was really important. I ran through why I was proud of that a moment ago. On real wages are going backwards. They were before the election and they are after the election. And that's largely now as a consequence of inflation with a 6 or a 7 in front of it.
8.
We haven't seen that, but I understand you're referring to the Reserve Bank's forecast. Until we get that inflation down, we won't have real wages growth in this country. But wages growth itself is picking up. It's picking up as a consequence of what's happening in the minimum wage. It's picking up as a consequence of some of the other steps that we're taking. It will pick up more when it comes to things like workers in the care economy, where we're supporting wage rises. Wages growth is starting to pick up, but there won't be real wages growth until we get inflation under control, and that's why the budget I handed down was so focused on inflation.
And just again, to try to get some guidance, because so much of what we're talking about here is coming with a big dose of hope and a big dose that things go right elsewhere. You were talking about 2024. In the same way you're having to question projections, do you now have to question that as well, that you may not be able to deliver real wage growth by 2024, given the trajectory of inflation?
Oh, I think we will. I believe we will. If your question is, can we always accurately predict inflation or wages growth 18 months or 24 months out, of course we can't always be perfect about it. But I guess the assurance that I give this audience and people watching at home is that the difference now compared to before the election is our predecessors said that keeping wages low was a deliberate design feature of their economic policy. We take a different approach. We want to get wages growing again. We want it to be responsible and sustainable, but we want that wages growth to be strong. And that's why we're changing industrial relations. It's why we're changing wages in the care economy. It's why we supported the minimum wage rise. It's why we want to train people for higher wage opportunities. We want to make it easier for mums and dads to earn more and work more and earn more if they want to. All of these things are important because we want to get wages growing again. We'll get real wages growth when we get inflation down at the same time.
A video now from Sebastian Rossi.
Jim Chalmers, the Paul Keating government of the 1990s saw the mortgage repayment rates go up to as high as 18%. With the inflation rate being almost identical as the 1990s and the ever-increasing interest rates of the Reserve Bank of Australia, are we seeing a repeat of history? How will we control the inflation rates and what happens if it will reach 10%?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about that, haven't we? And you can't, can you?
Well, nobody who follows interest rates in the markets or elsewhere is expecting anything like what we saw in the first half of the 90s. Absolutely nobody is expecting that. The budget itself assumes it follows what the Reserve Bank Governor has said about rates will go up a little bit more, but nobody's expecting the outcome that Sebastian is going to. But again, and I think his question came to this at the end as well, interest rates are determined by what's happening with inflation. The whole reason why we delivered a budget which was so responsible, so restrained, invested in the drivers of growth with low inflation, is because we understand that inflation is the biggest challenge that we have. And if we don't get on top of it, interest rates will be higher for longer and people will cop it in the neck. And that's why, I sat down to make a budget with my colleagues, 5 months ago we started working on it. And our choice was, would we splash a lot of cash around and get good headlines in the media and there'd be economic consequences for that? Or do we try and get the economics right and let the rest of it, let the political cards fall where they may? And the truth is that one of the reasons why, the budget reception has not been kind of unanimous kind of celebration is because we've had to do difficult things. But we've made those...
The problem is, you didn't. That's the criticism.
No, I don't accept that.
No, the criticism is that where there were things that could have directly changed the lives of people like Fiona, that we haven't seen those things. That people earning $500,000 can get access to childcare subsidies. That the rich are going to get richer. And the harsh reality of inflation you're telling people is that you're going to have to hurt them more to get on top of inflation. That's the reality.
Well, no, the reality is that it will hurt more if we don't get on top of inflation. You know, choosing a restrained and responsible budget is the lesser of two evils. And that's the point that I'm making. You know, nobody would be happier than me if we had all of the room in the budget to hand out lots of cash. The reality is, if we let this inflation challenge get out of control, then that will hurt people more than any restrained and disciplined budget ever could. And it will fall disproportionately on the most vulnerable people in our society.
Let's go to a question from Daniel Rianto.
To combat inflation, in the simplest forms, Australia needs to spend less. Would you consider increasing GST or similar tax to curtail spending?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Don't intend to do that. Won't be increasing the GST. I think what the Reserve Bank is doing in lifting interest rates is about trying to take some money out of the economy. Our job is more on the other side of the economy. How do we invest in making it grow faster without inflation getting out of control? And that's why, you know, dealing with labour shortages is a big part of our plan. You know, fee-free TAFE, university places, our childcare policy, all of these things are about investing in people so that we can grow the economy more quickly without adding to inflation. But it's our intention not to make this problem on the demand side of the economy worse, but we don't see tax changes as a way to pull more money out of the economy. That's largely the job of the Reserve Bank.
But you have indicated, and you indicated in the budget, that there are big ticket items that are going to require a lot more revenue. You're going to have to look at the taxation mix at some point, NDIS, aged care, defence, a whole lot of things. At what point do you start to look at the tax mix? At what point do you look at things like capital gains tax potentially on the family home, removing the 50% discount on capital gains on investment properties, when you look at things like negative gearing? And we know tax is the third rail, don't we? You touch that and it can be political death. But you're going to have to tackle that, aren't you, between now and when you next go to the polls?
I do think this country needs tax reform. I've made no secret of that. And I think what we showed in the budget is that you need to move simultaneously on a number of fronts. You need to have spending restraint. And so we got this, as a country, we got this surge in revenue from higher commodity prices. We let that flow through the budget rather than spend it. That's important. That's the key reason why there's less debt in my budget over the next 4 years than there was in my predecessor's budget. You need to trim spending. We found $22 billion worth of savings. The last budget had $0 in savings on the expenditure side. But tax reform has a role to play. We started last week with some multinational tax reforms, some reforms around compliance and a couple of other kind of medium-sized measures. And I think in lots of ways that's the template. When you're trying to get a budget on a more sustainable footing so that you can pay for the NDIS, you can pay for health and aged care and good defence spending, and when you're conscious of the fact that the fastest growing area of spending in the budget is actually the interest costs on the debt that is already there, then once you recognise all of that, then obviously every budget, a bit like the one last week, needs to consider and contemplate spending restraint, spending cuts and tax changes to make the budget more sustainable.
Next question comes, it's a video from Sinadurai Silvakumar.
Good evening, Minister. My question is, what is America trying to do by sending B-52s to the Northern Territory? Is it, in your opinion, that's a good move for the region and in the interest of Australia-China relationship?
Well, I think it is important that we have strong partnerships and strong alliances, and this is part of that. And again, going back to some of the things that you've thought about and written about, Stan. Our region is becoming a more difficult place to manage. It's why we've, my colleague Penny Wong and others, Richard Marles and Pat Conroy, have put so much effort into our near neighbourhood in the Pacific. It's why, we've signed under our predecessors the AUKUS deal. And that is because we do need to value these relationships, these alliances. Our region is becoming a more complex place to be part of. We support the status quo in our region at the same time as we recognise that some of these pressures are intensifying. And so this decision is one that I support for all of those reasons.
It does add another dimension to what is already a rocky relationship with China, and China is our biggest trading partner. It's the biggest engine of economic growth in the world. If you're going to meet the projections that you're hoping for, we need a strong relationship economically with China. How do we achieve both?
Yeah, well, our preference is for a really prosperous and really peaceful region. And that's why we've put a lot of effort into stabilising the relationship with China in recent months. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that China hasn't become more assertive in the region. I think that's self-evident. I think you've written and spoken about that before. I think a lot of people are very focused on that. Our interests in Australia are best served by the status quo in our region, by peace and prosperity, and the decisions that we take in foreign policy and in economic policy need to and do reflect that.
Let's go to a question now from Paula Turner. Hi, Paula.
Good evening, Mr. Chalmers.
Hi, Paula.
Your history teacher made a huge and positive impact on you. What words do you have for the many teachers leaving the profession because of being overworked and undervalued? And what can a Labor government do to influence policy change to attract teachers back to the profession?
You're a teacher, Paula?
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Paula, thank you. And to all of those teachers that you're referencing, we need you. We desperately need you. My colleague Jason Clare, the Education Minister, has made an announcement today about how we deal with this shortage of teachers. I can't believe how happy your question would make my history teacher. His name's Norbert Grulich. Probably the most influential person in my life, not in my own family. And I can just tell by looking at you, Paula, that there must be hundreds of people around this country who would feel the same way about you. My teacher believed in me at a point where I didn't believe in myself. And that's the big gift that I think teachers give kids.
We don't value them, though, do we, to the extent that we should? And I know that what the Minister was talking about today, Jason Clare, is working with states and looking at a blueprint to be able to work together to do just that.
Totally. I mean, this is the challenge, right? We understand the indispensable role that teachers play in our society for all of the reasons Paula would know as well as anyone. And we need to find ways to value teachers more, to retain them better. In my own community, I talk to a lot of school principals where they have these amazing teachers come in and all the effort goes into retaining them. It's hard to retain teachers. They go to more lucrative positions, or they retrain, or they might go and have kids and then not come back. All of these challenges that Jason Clare's very attuned to. But I really want to assure you, Paula, that we place the same kind of value on teachers that you obviously do. And I can't think of any of the colleagues that I have who haven't had an experience like I've had with Norbert and many of your students would have had with you.
I would say the same, Paula. I remember one teacher in particular, and I'm very lucky that I came across him or I wouldn't be here. Thank you. To finish tonight's discussion, here's Eva Palajärvi. Have I said that right, Eva?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, Jim. My question is that whose face would you like to see on the next $5 note? Replacing Queen Elizabeth, should it be an Australian face or King Charles? And of course, behind this question, I want to know whether Labour government would make Australia a republic. And please don't answer to me that this is a Reserve Bank's job.
You should have my job, Ava. We'll take the $5 note. Who do you want to see on there?
I would. Well, the reason I'm dancing now is because it is genuinely Phil Lowe's decision, but we've been talking about it. And look, my preference would be to have an Australian or an Australian design on there of some kind. The Governor of the Reserve Bank has indicated it's a choice between the King or a design, in his view. And, you know, I would rather see something Australian on the $5 note. It's not a decision that I take, or it's certainly not a decision that I take alone. On the Republic front, absolutely. Absolutely. And the first thing that we need to do is a voice to Parliament. When we achieve that together, then we need to move on a Republic. I cannot believe that a country like us, in this day and age, couldn't see itself with one of our own as our head of state. I think that's so important. It's one of the reasons why I'm here in the first place. But first, the voice to Parliament.
Ava, let's just hope with inflation going up that $5 stays worth $5. That's what we need to worry about. That's all we have time for again. Please thank our guest, Jim Chalmers. Thank you. Thank you, Treasurer. It's a great opportunity to sit here and have just these types of discussions. So I really appreciate you giving us your time and sharing this time tonight with our audience. Please thank you as well to all of you at home for helping to shape this conversation, sending your questions in via video. Everybody who has brought their questions here tonight as well. I'm having a spell next week. David Spears is going to be in the chair, filling in live from Melbourne. Minister for Early Childhood Education and Youth, Anne Ali, and British author Camilla Shamsi will join the panel to answer your questions. Go to our website to register to be in the audience. Until I see you again, have a great night.